More than 400 vintage players signed up to play with real power in Pittsburgh for Eternal Weekend, North America. Welcome back, vintage gamers, to the Eternal Weekend recap video. I am going to go over my deck list, the results, the metagame, round by round, notes from each match in this 9-round, 407-player vintage tournament, as well as my round by round notes from legacy champs that had over 1,100 people. This is going to be a little bit of a spoiler alert. I have 3 more videos of pre-recorded content from Eternal Weekend that will be airing after this. So if you don't want to spoil yourself, maybe watch those videos first, then come back to this, whatever works for you. But I wanted to make sure I got this out there so people could see my thoughts about my deck, my play, the metagame in general, and basically what happened in Pittsburgh. So you're looking at my deck, and it will come as probably not a big surprise to most of you. If you are following this channel, you know that I have recently put out the video where I got a challenge first place with this deck list, as well as multiple trophies. I've been really extremely happy with this deck, the way it plays, how it plays. It almost rejuvenated my entire excitement for the tournament. Honestly, 2-3 weeks before Eternal Weekend, I was very depressed about the state of vintage, what decks I would have to choose from, and I was not super thrilled to be playing 3 weekends of Eternal Magic in a row. Not only am I playing Eternal Weekend, which just happened this past weekend, but this weekend I'll be flying to Italy to play 4 Seasons, and the weekend after that, training over to Prague to play Eternal Weekend in Europe. So lots of legacy and vintage coming for me, and I was not super excited. However, we have found what we were looking for. What I was looking for was a non-linear combo deck with toolbox, with a game plan that had a variety of ways to attack opponents and wasn't all in on what it was trying to do. From my viewpoint, the vintage format is very narrow, but there are a lot of deck choices. So let's see if I can parse that out for you. Luris Control, Esper, and Blue-Black is the best deck in the format. Not by a huge margin, but by a decent size. It is your best choice to play in the field, and it was the deck that performed the best at this tournament. It is a controlling deck that is slow and can pick apart what the opponent is trying to do. All of the other viable decks, and there are quite a lot of them, in my opinion, are very linear jamming combo decks. Now, the way they do combos are all very different. So you have Jewel jamming for the artifact combo. Dredge is your Bazaar all-in Graveyard Bazaar Baghdad deck. Mono White Initiative, Youthbase Justin, that's not a combo deck, it's an aggro deck. It's very close to like a Stompy style combo deck where you're mulliganing to fast mana and a lock piece on turn 1. It is an aggro deck, but it's definitely a very powerful mulligan-oriented linear strategy. And Oath is not being built as a control deck anymore. Oath is very much being built as jamming Oath, jamming Show and Tell, and not having a lot of interaction. So all of these decks, in my opinion, are viable, are strong, and that's a good thing. You know, you have lots of different choices on how you like to do your playstyle, but I don't think they really fit what I'm looking for in a vintage deck. My favorite vintage deck of all time is 2019 Esper Pio, where you're playing a powerful Tinker combo deck, a powerful Paradoxical Alchemy combo deck, but you're also playing Vampiric Demonic for a variety of different answers. You're playing Swords to Plowshares. You're being able to adapt on the fly to what your opponents are doing and make different choices. And when I found this deck, it fulfilled exactly what I was looking for. So this is my version of Luris Volt Key. Might have been previously known as Turbo Volt Key. Could you call it Luris Pio? This is a deck that was pretty prevalent. Not pretty prevalent. It was a minor niche choice in the 4 Saga metagame because it was a deck built around 4 Saga, really. But what Hank Zong did, and that was the person I started the list from, was build it more in the direction of Paradoxical Outcome and less about the Urza Saga, which you can only play 1 copy now. So What this list does, you're down 3 sagas, but instead of playing 1, 2 paradoxical outcomes, we're on the full 4 paradoxical outcomes with mox opals. So we're having a powerful combo-oriented game plan with paradoxical outcome, and then many ways to put together the time vault voltaic key combo, taking infinite turns. I should say manifold key clearly the better classic combination. And we can find that with Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, and Oswald Fiddlebender, kind of the card that maybe glues together all of your interesting one-of choices. So this is a Birthing Pod style effect on a creature that can be returned with Luris, and you are going to go up 1 artifact mana value and find something in your toolbox. And the toolbox is really nice. I don't think it's a perfect toolbox yet, but we're definitely getting to a really solid point. You have lots of interesting 1-drops that you can get. Soul Guide Lantern, very good against Luris strategies and Bazaar strategies. Vexing Bauble is great at shutting off your opponent's interaction. Sensei's Top can help you find and filter your draws. Key can untap Mana Vault, but also, of course, is your main Time Vault win condition. And then the biggest one, I believe, is Portable Hole, which lets you exile non-land permanent and opponent controls 2 mana value or less. That's going to hit some very important cards like Collector Roof, like Null Rod, your opponent's Time Vault, maybe your opponent's Psychic Frog. This card is hitting a lot of very important interaction pieces that would normally affect our deck. So this is sweet toolbox, blue, non-linear combo, and I feel like it has all the right answers to beat the metagame. This is the exact same 75 which I registered and won the challenge with. I have not made any changes. I have not found anything that I wanted to change so far. I was worried a little bit leading into the event if I had a good enough dredge matchup, but I played a bunch of matches versus dredge in my final league, and I really was happy with the minimal dredge sweep. The reason is you do have your main deck strip mine that you can get. You have your main deck Soul Guide Lantern, and you are, of course, presenting a fast combo kill. These are all the things you really need to be able to steal game 1s from dredge. If your deck can steal game 1s from dredge, you're putting yourself in an incredible position to win the dredge matchup because you have two post-board games where you can draw your very powerful hate pieces. Tabernacle, Needle, Cage, Containment Priest, and so on. So I liked the dredge matchup. Dredge matchup was good. I wouldn't say it's like amazing. You could definitely make the dredge matchup better, but I think it was enough. And all the sideboard slots are very important on helping swing the matchups that I thought we would face. So if you want to see more about this deck, definitely go back and check the challenge video. I think the challenge video is probably the best video where you get to see a variety of decks and the deck performing at peak power. Maybe you can even go back to the first video where we changed the deck list from what Hank had originally registered. The big change I made to this deck list from the original deck list that I took from was I made the deck play 4 Flooded Strands, a basic island, and a basic plains, instead of playing 4 Lorien Revealeds, we're only on 2 Lorien Revealeds. The big reason here is the basic plains is very important at beating decks where you need to cast Swords to Plowshares. So I think one of the biggest upsides of these Esper combo-oriented decks is you get to play 4 Swords to Plowshares to beat the creature decks of the format. One of the main problems is the creature decks of the formats are always going to play Wasteland. In fact, most decks in this format play Wasteland. Wasteland was the second most registered card at Eternal Weekend behind Force of Will. When you are playing those decks, you are going to draw multiple Swords to Plowshares / Portable Holes. If you fetch a Tundra and have your Tundra Wastelanded and it strands your second Swords to Plowshares in your hand, you are going to have a very hard time winning the game. So it's important to have a basic plains, which you can fetch, that will allow you to play multiple swords and portable holes, activate Oswald, balance, whatever. And I think that gives you a much more robust mana base, a less easier to attack mana base from a Wasteland perspective, and the ability to play a longer game, which this deck does want to do. This deck is very much stop, make sure your opponent can't do the broken thing they're trying to do, and then put together a combo piece. Now, you do have some games that you go, mox, PO, win the game, and that's the other upside of playing this deck. You are basically assuming that Luris controlling role of the Esper Luris deck, but also have these oops, I win scenarios, which gives your deck a lot of power. That's why I really like this deck over playing an Esper Luris deck, even if it's not maybe it might not be the correct choice. But for me, as a combo-oriented player, someone who wants to make sure they get some amount of free wins, that was what I was really drawn to. And I actually think this deck has a pretty reasonable matchup into those Lurrus control decks. You are doing something more powerful. You're making them have answers, and you have so many removal spells for their main draw engine, Psychic Frog. So that's the deck. If you haven't seen this deck before, definitely go check out the other videos. It's super sweet, super powerful, and I was very excited to register it for Eternal Weekend. So for Eternal Weekend, I kind of expected a similar metagame to online. I felt like there would be mostly the same decks played at mostly the same numbers. Maybe you have slight shifts based on card availability. Maybe Jewel comes down a few percent because it's hard to get the cards for that deck. Maybe Bazaars go up a few percent because it's hard. That's one of the easier decks to acquire the cards for. And maybe you see a slight increase in unpowered or budget decks like Red Prison. That did end up being the case, but there were a few outliers. Let's go take a look at what happened in Eternal Weekend 2024. Here you're looking at a spreadsheet from a melee poll. Joe Dyer over at MTG Goldfish helped me out here and did this while I was still traveling back. So now we have the full data to show you of what happened here at Eternal Weekend. Now, most played deck in the field is Lurrus Control. Right now, you can see Esper and tied here with Oath. But if you add in blue-black, you're up instead around 60 copies of Lurrus Control. So Lurrus Control was the most played deck in the field, and it was the deck that did the best. It's actually an extremely high win rate, 58% for Esper Lurrus. It's clearly the best deck in the field, and it's clearly the best deck in the format, and this is what we knew going in. Esper Lurrus put a bunch of copies into the top 8, which we'll look at just in a minute. And I don't know, there's not much to say about it. 58% is a very high win rate, though, for 400 players as the tied for the most played deck. You could probably make an argument that's a slightly concerningly high win rate. Typically, over time, over large data sets, Wizards looks at 55% as the big number for ban restriction win rates, and that's kind of around where it's at these days. If I pull up the full sheet for post-restriction data, what you have here is 54% for blue-black, 52%-ish for Esper. Combine them, still fairly low, but below 55%. So this is this is Esper performing above expectations and being the deck of the tournament. Oath being the second most played deck is surprising, but not super surprising. Oath is a deck that people love to play in paper. It's just a very vintage-only deck. Gives you extremely good vibes, and it's something that you can't do elsewhere. It is a powerful deck that does a lot of good things, and it's very good against an increased supply of unpowered or budget decks. It's very good historically against Dredge and like the Red Prison and the Mono White Initiative and that kind of thing. It's also pretty good against the blue-black Lurrus deck, and it can sometimes struggle against the Esper Lurrus deck. And I must say, 52.4% win rate for Oath as the second most played deck. It's an overperformance. This is better than Oath is performing online. Oath is not performing above 50% online. So Oath being the, jumping from the sixth most played deck to the second most played deck and having an overperformance. Very, very interesting Oath data here. Jewel and Dredge were the third most played decks. Jewel had a slightly above 50% win rate. Dredge had slightly below 50% win rate. This is about what I would expect from Dredge. I would expect, more Dredge to be played in paper and for it to have a middling win rate, and that's what happened. Jewel, this is a deck that some people expected to be a very strong contender at Eternal Weekend. You might remember last year at Eternal Weekend, Jewel was a standout performer. However, I think the metagame and players have adapted well to Jewel existing. Have made their decks better against Jewel, play more Null Rods, play more counter spells, consign to memories, what have you, to make sure the Jewel matchup is thing. That being said, Jewel's still a very powerful deck. It has to be respected. If you don't have the right cards in your deck to beat Jewel, you're going to have a bad time. It looks like, for the most part, people showed up with the tools to beat Jewel, and Jewel was held to a 51.5% win rate, which is slightly lower than online. 11% meta share online versus, let me go here, right here. 9% in paper. So you can see, like I said, slight decrease in the amount of Jewel in paper because it's a hard deck to acquire in paper. All the Moxen, all the blue power, and workshops. So it's definitely a hard deck to play in paper just due to deck building constraints for cards. But it still had a pretty good showing, still a strong choice. So people who registered Jewel probably are not too upset about it. That being said, I did talk to some people who were upset about registering Jewel just because of the high variance inherent in the deck and the deck building. So initiative showing up in big numbers here, 36 initiative players, but not a very strong win rate. I just think initiative is, it feels like it's solved and respected by the field. You play enough removal spells, you're going to be doing fine against initiative. And I think we're kind of past initiative's peak, and I'm not sure it will be able to come back without some kind of change in printing. So initiative is definitely still a playable deck, but definitely a deck that's not going to perform super well into the field. And you kind of sacrifice, you have to go pretty all in to make sure you play a turn one hate piece to beat all, the 6 or 5 or 6 all in non-linear or linear combo decks. But then you kind of sacrifice your ability to play a longer, go over the top game against the Esper control deck. So it's a tough push and pull when you're registering initiative. The biggest surprise to me of the tournament was Red Prison at 25. 25 players registered Red Prison, 6% of the field. This was not all unpowered. I played against a Red Prison player who was playing power. I would say maybe the majority are powered. I haven't actually gone and looked into the very specifics of the 25 pilots who played Red Prison to see how many were powered or how many unpowered. I might do that if I have some time later, but that seems like something I'm not going to do right now. What this means to me is that a lot of people are playing Vintage who would normally not play Vintage and want to play Vintage. Red Prison is not an archetype that's a established, powered, strong archetype in the format. It's like it's a less than 2% meta share or something. Yeah, less than 1% meta share, only 0.3% meta share online. These are players who wanted to play Vintage, and this is what they could play. And I think that's amazing. I think that's awesome. I think that's a good sign for the future of the format. People are coming to Eternal Weekend and will really want to play Vintage, right? So although this is a 46% win rate, Red Prison, I don't even think that's that bad. If you assume that some amount of these Red Prison players are unpowered, going 46% win rate, having a higher win rate than Initiative, with a similar play rate, not super similar, but I mean, a pretty reasonable play rate, having similar stats or better stats than Initiative is, I think, a pretty big win. Red Prison was the deck I told people to play if they had to play unpowered. I think it does the best things. I think going Ancient Tomb into Null Rod into Blood Moon is a powerful 1-2 combination against a variety of decks in the format and can set you up to steal games. So yeah, that's probably the biggest surprise. This is a huge increase in the number of people who play Red Prison. Some people played Red Prison last year at Eternal Weekend, but not even anywhere close to this kind of numbers. To be fair, last year an unpowered Red Prison deck lost their win in 2 top 8, so that's a big driver as well. So really cool, really interesting stat here is 25 Red Prison players. Bug, still 22 players out of 400 registered Bug, and it did fine. 51% win rate about, very strong. I don't really have much more to say about Bug. I think Bug makes sense into the field, though it can kind of struggle when you have too many initiative players. But versus the top decks, I think Bug has some game plans that are definitely achievable. So decent showing for Bug, even maybe a little bit better than Bug is performing online. No, I guess it's around the same because Bug had a recent resurgence online, and he's had some solid win rates recently. And then Doomsday, actually kind of unexpectedly, 17 Doomsday players at a 52% win rate is very good. The big thing that happened here was at least a few pilots following Bryant Cook's lead were playing Considers instead of Preordains, so they could hold up Flusterstorm. Consider into, gives you more delve and instant speed, and then had a sideboard pivot into 3 Murktines. I tested recently a normal Doomsday list with 2 Murktides. I wasn't super thrilled. I didn't play against enough Lurrus to make say, but I was talking with Bryant just a little bit, and he said he played against 5 or so Lurrus opponents. It's the hardest matchup for Doomsday, and by having 3 Murktides in the board, being able to play Consider, he was able to help swing that matchup more in his favor and overpower the number of removal spells that people were leaving in. It's always a hard game to quantify. how many removal spells do I need to leave in against a Doomsday player? How many creatures they're going to bring in? So a lot of times, it's 1, 2 removal spells. If you're bringing in 3 Murktides, you're really going to overpower the number of removal spells they have, and maybe it's a way to swing the Lurrus matchup. I have to give him and any of the other pilots who registered that kind of strategy a big round of applause, because it's not something that I personally came up with. I was looking to find ways to play Doomsday and beat the Lurrus matchup, and I didn't really find anything that I liked. So if you are a Doomsday player and you like watching my Doomsday content, definitely take a look out for those deck lists and see if you too can find success in the Lurrus matchup using Consider and Murktides out of the board. Countervine is just not a playable deck in this current format. It is not strong enough. It is, some players were forced on Countervine just because they had Bazaars and they didn't want to play Dredge or whatever, what have you. But you just have to stay away from the deck now. It has not aged well, and there's not much more to say there. Breach. This is a deck we weren't sure how many players would transfer over from online to paper. Only 14, which I think is lower than I expected. I kind of was expecting more, like 30, 20, somewhere higher in this reach for Breach. But the players who did play the deck did perform fairly well. A very high win rate, the highest win rate of all the decks we have categorized here. But obviously, when you start getting down to 14 players, that's only 3.5% of the metagame. It's a low number. It's a high, volatility number. What is the confidence interval here? Standard deviation 10%. So like, it's not some kind of, oh man, this deck is broken. It's just, it was a low play rate, but the people who did play it did very well with it. This is a similar thing for something like Blue-Black Lurrus, which did very well in the hands of only 12 pilots. And the deck that I played, Lurrus Volkey, with only 10 pilots, also 56% win rate. So these 3 decks were your high-performing, low play rate decks. You did see some of that in the lower ends here. The only 8 players played Sphere-Based Workshop. That is the lowest number I've ever seen. Sphere-Based Workshop is on a huge downturn, but to be fair, the 8 players who play it didn't do too poorly, 54% win rate. So things to think about moving forward here. I doubt this Red Prison number ever stays for any future Magic Online events, but this Red Prison number could reflect some amount of play in the European event. I kind of doubt it. European players definitely are more interested in registering blue cards from my experience. So I wouldn't expect the Red Prison number to be so high in Europe, but maybe they see this and try to play out over there. So interesting data. If you go look at the top 8 here, I'm not a big fan of looking at the top 8 as any kind of representation for the field, but it is something that people take a look at. So why don't we do that as well? The top 8 contained 4 Lurrus control decks, 2 Jewel Shops, an Oath, and a Doomsday. So you can see 2 Jewel Shops, 4 Lurrus decks, and then I would say 2 combo decks. Oath is definitely a combo deck at this point. Not a super surprising top 8 in terms of archetypes represented when you think about what were the best performing archetypes in the field, what was doing really well. I don't know. This is kind of the top 8 I expected. I think Lurrus was the best deck. I think Jewel Shops was a very high power deck that had a lot of pilots. And then you got a couple other strong performance decks as well. So pretty reasonable deck. I have not watched the top 8 coverage. I'm thinking I might do a commentary over the top 8 coverage if people are interested in seeing that. Hopefully I could maybe take a look at that in the next day or 2 before I head up to Italy and see if I can get that recorded and put on the YouTube channel for you to watch. I have not seen any of the matches, so it would be all live reactions from me, which I think might be pretty interesting. I didn't even know. Oh, I did know that. Okay, so like lots of powerful wizards. Shout out to Max. He puts out very good content on Twitter, on YouTube, that you can watch for Legacy. Plays a lot of different blue decks in Legacy to a very high level. So him coming in and winning the tournament on Lurrus is amazing. He was borrowing some power. I believe he had maybe 1 Moxen beforehand. He wins this tournament, trades his Tinker away to acquire more pieces of power, and he will, be able to play future Eternal Weekends, future vintage events with his power won from this event, which I think is a great story. It's a really cool thing to happen. And just lots of great people and players in this top 8. Dave Kaplan is someone I typically forward people over to for coaching for Legacy and Vintage Eternal formats. I don't do coaching myself because I don't have enough time with my normal job. But Dave Kaplan is one of the players who I typically recommend other players go to get coaching. So that's a nice performance. Dave Kaplan also runs the New York City vintage paper events. So big win. A couple other players like David in the top 8 who I know, and shout out to them for strong performances. When you start looking down here at the other players in the top 16, you have some big names. This is Hank the Obese on MTGO, Lee Webb, and then you have Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm, Nathan Stewart, world champion. That was kind of a funny story in and of itself. Nathan Stewart registered my deck for the tournament. Now, to be fair, I never told anyone that they should play the deck that I played. I wanted to play the deck because I thought it was good and good for me. But obviously, when you win a challenge, on live stream, other players get into the deck and play it. I haven't actually gotten to talk to Nathan since, but I had heard from someone else that Nathan wasn't super happy with the deck. But obviously, this is a world champion, so 7-2 with Luris Volkey is a bit wild. That's really, I don't know. I thought that was kind of cool. I like Nathan, powerful player, and I got to see, some Luris Volkey handled at the highest level. Anything else from this top 16? Look at Bug down at 18. Good showing for Bug here. Lots of Luris in the top 8. All the way down to 24. We were just talking about Hank, who made the original Luris Volkey list that I started from. He also changed to Flooded Strands and a couple other tech pieces of his own design and went 7-2 as well. And then you can see, spoiler alert down here, I am also at 7-2, which is a fantastic record. But playing Luris Volkey, but not top 32. 3 7-2 players, including myself and eternal content creator, Bosch and Roll, Brian Koval, 7-2 finishes. So how did I become 7-2? No tinker. We can go and check out my round-to-round matchups. Moving over to our round-by-round coverage, what I did this time to make sure that I had good recollection of what was occurring in these matches is I did post-match back and forths with my opponents, helped me write down what happened during the games from their point of view, from my point of view. I think it was a pretty nice exercise. Shout out to all my opponents. All my opponents this weekend in both Vintage and Legacy were very cordial, very awesome opponents to have, and they all helped me out with writing my post-match notes. So shout out to all of them for making an extremely fun and enjoyable Magic weekend. Round 1, we had Sean on Stifle Knot. Now, this is a cool list, so we should take a look. This is a Null Drifter Phyrexian Dreadnought deck, dressed down, Doorkeeper Thrall, 4 actual factual Stifle. This is not a Luris deck, which is kind of interesting because that's how I would build the deck with Luris, but obviously the power of Null Drifter is quite high. This is a 4/4 Flying Annihilator, Divination. It's a monstrosity. It's definitely worth trying to work around. My biggest concern would be, is it worth losing Luris for? So the big point of the deck, from what I was talking with Sean about, was Doorkeeper Thrall. Now, Doorkeeper Thrall is a very powerful piece into the current Vintage format. If you look at its ability, artifact or static artifacts and creatures enter the battlefield, do not cause abilities to trigger. This is obviously the combination with Phyrexian Dreadnought to give you a 1-mana 12/12 trampler with no ability, obviously. But the main thing you need to think about is how does this actually affect the rest of the format? And pretty well. The number one thing is Coveted Jewel will not trigger when it enters the battlefield. That's probably your biggest one. But there's a variety of other things in the format. Atraxa does not trigger its draw or put cards in hand ability. One of the big interactions in our matchup is Portable Hole does not trigger its ability. So Portable Hole, while it would be normally a very good answer for Dreadnought, where the ability was like stifled or dressed down, Doorkeeper Thrall stops Portable Hole from being able to be triggered. So lots of really nice interactions with Doorkeeper Thrall as your Dreadnought combo piece against the Vintage format. So in round 1 versus Sean, I started game 1 with an Oswald. Sean had an evoked Null Drifter going back and forth, drawing cards. This was a very long game and a very interesting game, and actually one that I felt was kind of cool because there was a very interesting play that happened. I picked it up PO, I drew 4 cards, and I really drew basically nothing. And so Sean took the initiative here, not the real initiative, but just slammed the Doorkeeper Thrall with 2 Dreadnoughts. So I'm facing 24 trampling damage, and I can't Portable Hole these Dreadnoughts because there's a Doorkeeper Thrall in play. And so I'm sitting in play with an Oswald with a bunch of mana, a lot of Moxen, and I'm trying to figure out how the hell do I get out of this game. Number one, obviously, is to assemble a Vault Key combo, but I didn't have the resources to assemble the Vault Key combo. So I need to look for an answer now. And I have a Karakas in play that I tap and I use for Oswald's ability to take a Moxen and turn it into a Sensei's Top. With my Sensei's Top, I spin and I find a DT. I draw the DT and start searching my deck and immediately realize I made a mistake and actually limited my outs in the current situation. When I was looking through my deck, I realized I have this balance as a main out. Normally, balance doesn't work as a way out if you have a creature in play, because your opponent's going to keep their best creature, they're still going to keep a 12/12, it's going to be a real big problem. However, I have a Karakas in play. Oswald is a legendary that I can balance with my Karakas. So what I could have done is not use the white mana from Karakas to make Oswald search and find the top, but I could have held that mana, used a different white source. That way, if I spun my top and found a balance, I could bounce the Oswald back to my hand and then balance away the Doorkeeper Thrall and 2 Dreadnoughts. So I'm kicking myself a little bit, but the game isn't over when you still need to find a way to play through. I DT for a Time Walk to give myself an extra turn and give myself another look at a balance or a combo-oriented draw, something that will help me out. I take the Time Walk turn, I untap, I don't find an answer, and what I do is my Sensei's Top is back in my deck after drawing and then shuffling with Demonic Tutor. I use the Oswald, not tapping the Karakas this time, to turn another Moxen into the Sensei's Top. Sensei's Top spins, and what do you know? Finds a balance on the top of my library. Bounce the Oswald back to my hand, draw the balance, and balance away the Dreadnoughts, and eventually win the game. That came down to the very last turn, as I was at 1 life and had a tap Mana Vault. I had to pay for mana, untap the Mana Vault, pass, before coming back to my final turn and winning the game. The game 2 didn't have much else going on, but that Karakas Oswald line was a line I almost got punished for missing. And that's, I think, one of the cool parts about my deck is there's a lot of interesting and exciting ways to get out of different situations because you have all kinds of different answers in your deck. So that was maybe my favorite play of the entire tournament in round 1 of day 1 on Friday in Vintage. So I start off the tournament 1-0, beating Stiflenot. Moving to round 2 versus Drewby, we had a feature match on camera, so we can actually go watch it and talk about it. I don't think it was maybe the most exciting match, but it was a very fun match for me. My opponent was a Grey Sport and was also playing Lurrus Vault Key. So on camera, round 2 feature match versus Lurrus PO. I'm going to do my best to keep this going fast so you can see it. This is my starting hand, which is not actually super powerful. We've got Karakas, Tolarian Academy, Lorien to get a real land. I have a Mental Misstep here to slow down my opponent with a Snapcaster and a PO. Not a hand that you would typically keep in the blind, but we're not in the blind because both players have revealed Lurrus, and I think that's very important. We're actually in a point in the format where Lurrus is typically signifying a slower controlling deck. Now, obviously, my Lurrus deck is not as slow and controlling, but it's still a little bit on the slower side for a combo deck. You can keep different hands based on if your opponent reveals a Lurrus or not. So I'm going to choose to keep this hand, even though it's not the most powerful. On the play, starting with Karakas and playing a Voltaic Key so that my Tolarian Academy on the next turn can be used. Now, my opponent's hand in this game is much more powerful than mine. It contains Black Lotus, Moxen, tons of really good stuff. And it's actually going to be very hard for me to win this game. But Magic is not played by 2 computers. Magic is played by 2 humans, and anything can happen. So you really just need to do your best and play to your outs. So let's see if I can maybe get a stop of the hand here. But you can see Mox, Lotus, Bauble, Land, and Gataxian Probe means Andrew knew my whole hand, knows my only interaction is a misstep, and something unfortunate does happen in here. Now, there's a lot of different ways that Andrew can approach this hand because he has a Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor just gets us the most powerful card in our deck. Now, the problem here is the most powerful card in our deck is almost always Ancestral. Unless you're getting Time Vault Key and winning the game, we don't have Tinker to tinker for a Citadel. Demonic Tutor is going to be almost always getting Ancestral. But in this sense, in this turn, you can't get Ancestral here because I have a misstep. And so if you get Ancestral, I just get too much value. And so what opponents should probably do from this spot is DT for, well, we're gonna see if we can find that. Let's get the full hand here. See if we can figure out. It looks like it's DT, Force, Swords, and I have to see if I can figure out that card. But definitely, there's no reason to crack Lotus first. That's the first thing. Opponent cracks Lotus. We can just use, and we do end up using Pearl C to DT. So you'll probably see from my thing, I got some weird facial expressions going on here because I am super confused. I don't know why we're cracking this Lotus. I don't know what exactly we're doing. But you have to just remember we're on camera. We're in the beginning of a tournament and we're playing a thing. So opponent goes and straight off the bat Ancestrals right into the misstep. Probably not ideal, and something that we talked about post game. Just a fumble. It happens. So Ancestral goes into misstep, and now I'm feeling, kind of okay about this. Maybe we're actually in an okay spot here. Is it a portable hole? I'm trying to figure out. If say this third card is a blank here, what can we actually DT for from this spot? Let's see. We've got 5 mana. 5 mana is a very awkward number, so I don't think we're gonna be able to do anything immediately. So our options are actually things like DT for mana sources. That way we can go towards a Lurrus plan. So you're kind of dissuaded from going towards a Lurrus plan because I have the Caracas in play, which makes it kind of hard to go for mana and then use your Lurrus and play Lotus. But, Caracas isn't stopping Lurrus full sail. You still have this bobble here, so every time you play Lurrus, you can still draw extra cards. Another thing you can consider doing is if we have extra mana in our hand, which it doesn't feel like we had extra mana in our hand, you can go for something like a Paradoxical Outcome, try to keep the Lotus in play. Something like a Mana Crypt gives you access to Pearl UC as your blue and 2, so 4 mana. You can do maybe a PO for 4. So there's definitely some other options here other than Ancestral. So now Bobble gets cracked. You see a Strand on the top of my deck, and we actually lose out on our Lotus mana, which I don't like. I really dislike, because the Ancestral is going to get misstep, and so you really would want to you could actually get Ancestral from this spot, even though I have a misstep, but you just don't think you should crack your Lotus. You can hold on to the Ancestral, look for a better spot to play your Ancestral later, maybe a spot where you actually have Force plus blue card as a way to protect it. So it's not all in. And I don't want to harp on this too much because I already talked with Andrew about it. We all know about it. Chat was not very kind about it. But it's important to see what you could have done differently. So let's continue playing out this game. From here, my opponent has used a lot of his powerful cards, and what I need to do is put myself in a position to start turning the game in my favor. So we have a Tundra coming down. I wonder if I can do skip ahead in this. Sorry, this one's on the fly, but I figured if we have coverage, we might as well use it, right? All right, so my opponent has a Lurrus and buys the Lurrus. I'm going to use my Lorien Revealed and find another land. I'm just going to slowly build out my my spots. And now, if you stop here and we look at what's in my hand, I have a Snapcaster Mage. That's my big thing. I don't have that much. I have 2 more lands because I actually ended up drawing some lands, even though I had the Lorien Revealed. I have a Snapcaster Mage and a PO. So I am still not in a very good spot. I know my opponent has put Lurrus in their hand, so I would like to keep up Caracas to bounce their thing, and I want to keep Snapcaster Mage up to have Snap Mental Misstep. So I'm not going to buy Lurrus here. I am just going to move forward and playing a little slow. You can see my opponent's hand now. It looks like it's Portable Horse, Swords, Force. So has the ability to stop me from doing anything, and has the ability to just start playing this Lurrus and getting value from it. So really, I still haven't even turned the corner in this game. I'm still behind, even with opponent maybe fumbling some amount of value on turn 1. I think that's just the power of having Lotus, having Ancestral. These kind of things can just put you so far ahead. So another bobble, another draw, gets to look at my top card, knows what my top card is, and from there, probably just simply pass the turn. At the end of turn, I'm going to activate the Caracas. I'm going to put that card back into hand, and we're going to see if the top of my library is kind to me. And I believe it is. I think it was a white border card, if I presume correctly. maybe something like a merchant scroll. Let's take a quick peek. It was a demonic tutor. So I'm going to crack and demonic tutor, shortcutting those. And this is actually a super interesting spot. And this is one of the reasons why, even though I didn't feel like this game was, particularly close when we watch out the whole thing, there are lots of choices along the way and lots of different things to talk about. So I'm casting demonic tutor. What am I looking to get? What does my opponent think I'm going to get? Because my opponent here has force. Is my opponent supposed to force this demonic tutor? Now I've already played my land drop, so the one card that my opponent can't force on the way back down is like Urza Saga, but I've already played my land drop this turn, so it doesn't make sense for me to get an Urza Saga. So I think my opponent can let this go. You don't have to counter this demonic tutor. However, they do know that I have an instant speed Snapcaster Mage, and if I go for something like Ancestral Recall, simply countering the Ancestral Recall is not going to stop the full value of Ancestral Recall because I can later snap Ancestral back. So knowing that I can get Ancestral Recall, and it's one of my major things you can get, you actually probably should counter this demonic tutor. That being said, a Snapcaster Mage can still snap back the demonic tutor and then puts the problem off for later. So it's not like a 100% one way or the other. And now another thing that Andrew has to think about here is, what if I go demonic tutor for Time Vault? I already have a manifold key in play. Is that going to be a problem like that? So there's lots to think about here. And Andrew does tank for a little while on whether to force this, and decides to allow me to demonic tutor. So now all the things that I was just thinking about are going through my head, and I decide to tutor for Ancestral Recall. Ancestral Recall to me is the spell that gets me out of this spot and the spell that combines best with the cards in my hand, and you're going to see why in a few seconds. So from here, my opponent has to respect the fact that I could put together Time Vault Key off of my demonic tutor. So Portable Hold comes down on my manifold key. This is a double whammy where, one, it's going to take away my ability to Time Vault Key combo, and two, it's going to turn off 1 mana off of my Tolarian Academy. Now, I have an interesting spot here because I didn't tutor for Time Vault. So I don't actually care about this key besides losing 1 mana, which I don't think is a super impactful spot right now. Based on the current spot, I don't think losing that extra blue mana is going to matter too much. But my opponent doesn't know that I haven't tutored for Time Vault. And I am kind of getting a read here that my opponent might have counter magic based on the way they play the game. I don't know. I know from my memory that I had that read. I don't exactly know what from this tells from this beginning section of the game made me have that read, but that sometimes that's a part of playing lots of Magic. So what I see here is a spot where I can maybe force out some counter magic by making my opponent think that I have Time Vault Key. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use the Snapcaster Mage that I thought I might flashback Ancestral with as a way of fighting with this Portable Home. And it's kind of awkward because it's not actually that good to mental misstep Portable Hole, because Portable Hole can come back with Luris. However, my opponent cannot play Luris and bring back Portable Hole in the same turn because of how much white mana that costs, triple white mana. So what I'm going to do here is like force the issue a little bit and play Snap and misstep the Portable Hole. Now, my opponent should know that I only have Mental Misstep in my yard, so this is actually an opportunity where you can just counter the Snapcaster Mage. The Snapcaster Mage in play is actually pretty important. It can block a Luris, it can get picked up by a later PO, so really my opponent needs to actually force this Snapcaster Mage if they want to interact with the Mental Misstep targeting the Portable Home. So another slight spot where I am just giving my opponent room to make human choices. And so here, my opponent does end up considering that the Portable Hole on key must, have value, should resolve, and I actually get the baited Force of Will out of my opponent here. It's not actually this is actually really good for me. I don't actually care that this Portable Hole is coming in and taking the Voltaic key or the Manifold key, because it will come back eventually. I'm not too worried about that. So now what I've done is I've gotten my opponent's counter magic out of my opponent's hand, and giving me an opportunity to come back in this game. And that's what you need to do. You need to create opportunities for yourself. So now that my opponent doesn't have a force, I go to my next turn, I play my land, and I cast Ancestral targeting me and see what happens, and it resolves. So now that the Ancestral is resolved, my Demonic Tutor has gotten a lot of value, and you can see I actually have a lot of action to follow up here. So now that I have a lot of action, we can probably start going fast forwarding through this turn a little bit, but I have, Mox, and then I have PO, and then this PO, it gets to pick that Snapcaster back up that didn't get Force of Willed, so we're drawing 3, and from here, we're going to start to run away with the game. I have a lot of options in my hand, but the one that makes the most sense is snapping back that Ancestral. So I don't have enough right now to snap back PO, but the Ancestral Recall that I tutored for, that I thought would be good later with Snapcaster Mage, but then went away from to Snapcaster the Misstep, ends up coming back where I can now pick the snap up with PO, and then snap back the Ancestral. This is a lot of the reasons why I love the Snapcaster in the PO deck. You have lots of very powerful, cheap targets, and the synergy with Paradoxical Outcome is super high. So from this point, it's mostly garbage time as I've significantly outdrawn my opponent. I'm going to use the Soul Guide Lantern to make sure my opponent can't get any more value with the Lurrus, bounce the Lurrus back to the hand, and pass with a ton of counter magic up. From there, my opponent is just so far behind in terms of mana, in terms of cards, has all of the, stranded swords, stranded balance in hand. Both of these are not really doing anything. Does draw a nice, this is actually kind of an interesting point, so we should stop here. Does draw a nice Fiddlebender per turn. Fiddlebender is a card that can help them power out from here, and can help overpower this Karakas and get something else to stay in play. However, the Soul Guide Lantern is going to wipe out the Black Lotus, and it's not going to matter too much, as I can untap, and then with all the cards that I have, overpower my opponent's interaction. So I do go for a Brainstorm first, which gets meant by a Mythal Misstep, but then I have Merchant Scroll. Merchant Scroll gets a PO. From there, PO draws through my whole deck, and eventually I Portable Hole my opponent's Portable Hole to bring back Key and take Time Vault and win. Now, a lot of people are going to respond from this and say, well, you shouldn't have won that game, Justin. And it's true, but this is why we play Magic, because it's two players playing against each other, and anything can happen. This is not two computers playing against each other. And so you need to be at your best and give yourself the highest opportunity to win the game, even when the cards that you're presented with don't give you the highest chance to win the game. So we go on to game 2. And we talk about, let's see what we have here. I don't know if I have a view of the hands. Let's see. Gitaxian Probe, so we can look at my hand. So this is another one. I actually have watched this game back on coverage already, just to hear what Reed and the commentators had to say. And they were mostly on for what I'm talking about, but this is a very fair hand again. I am not mulliganing, and the reason I think this is a keep is because it's in the lower range of keeps, and that's something I want to start pushing as a concept for poker players. They already know the concept of a range. What kind of hands can we keep here? And this is definitely on the lower range of the keep, where I'm not super happy about keeping this, but it's definitely one of my keepable hands. This hand has nice early answer to Oswald and Lurrus, and now I'm not keeping many of these kind of answers in. This is definitely a combo-oriented mirror. I would love to have some interaction on the stack, but this hand definitely has power in terms of fast mana, Demonic Tutor for either cards or interaction, and then it has long-term staying power with the Sensei's Top. So I'm going to keep this hand, even though I don't think it's like a super strong one, and see how it plays out. And it will turn out that my opponent also kept a hand that similarly does not have as much power. And it has power, but doesn't have power in the right ways. So here you can see multiple restricted cards being able to buy a Lurrus immediately. But the hand is Lurrus, Time Vault, Force, Plains. And so my opponent has mana and can stop me from doing a fast combo, but doesn't really have any way to gain advantage over time. And my hand doesn't have any fast combo that these negations would hit, but it has ways to gain advantage over time, so it lines up very well here. And that's something you have to think about too, is like sometimes your hands are going to line up against certain subsets of your opponent's range. Here, my opponent, keeping this hand, you probably can consider mulliganing this hand, but maybe I wouldn't. Like, it's very hard to always have fast mana, and fast mana is very important in this deck. It's going to help you get ahead. It's going to help you cast Lurrus, and it's going to let you activate your POs. So it's always important to keep fast mana hands, but you just have to be, aware of the fact that if I don't go for a combo kill, these negations are not going to be super strong, and I'm not doing anything else to leverage. Another important thing to note here is that Plains is a card that I board out in the matchup typically. Plains is a card that I typically board out when I'm not getting wastelanded, and I don't need access to have multiple swords cast. So Plains is a card that I would have considered boarding out for something that has more impact on the matchup. So that's another problem here. Combining the fact that we have Plains with basic island, off-color, Mox, and a colorless mana crypt means we actually can't play Lurrus right away, even if we had something to return. So there's a lot of deficiencies in this hand, and it's going to show pretty quickly going into this game. So I lead off with Demonic Tutor, and my opponent is given the ability to negate this. And it's something you really have to consider. Like, what are we hitting with this Force of Negation? What can my opponent get in response? And I would really like, I think, from my opponent's side to see this card negated. And I do believe it does. Yeah, it does end up getting negated. You want to capitalize on your powerful spells. It's not like you can hard cast these negations in the future because you still don't have a second blue source with the basic Plains in the hand. So I think this is like a fairly good time to trade your interaction for a powerful card of mine. So I'm okay with that. But I have ways to rebuy as long as my opponent doesn't go too crazy. So the biggest problem here is I don't have a force in my hand if my opponent has paradoxical outcome. That is the biggest worry. It's absolutely possible that I would have gone demonic for a force, so I would have force blue card, and it would give myself time against my opponent's combo draws to really, really move forward. So that's what I'm praying for. I'm praying for no force. And it's like tough for my opponent too, because like they can't use this negation. If they had a PO, they can't use this negation to protect the PO unless they PO on my turn, which is definitely doable, but absolutely opens you up to stuff like Flusterstorm and Spell Pierce. So it definitely is non-trivial to figure out the timing windows for these things. My opponent does draw a very nice card here in Oswald, and it's something we end up talking about a lot in this tournament or this round because my opponent has probed my hand in this game and knows about my Swords to Plowshares, which is, not a huge number in my deck, but I have the direct answer to Oswald. And Oswald really is the only thing Andrew has going for him in this hand. Oswald is going to push you towards a Time Vault key combo. You would play the Time Vault, and then you'd be able to turn your Mox into a key on the next turn and win. So it's enticing for my opponent to play the Oswald to present a combo kill, but my opponent knows I have the swords, so maybe we need to play this game in a way that somehow different. Now, if we could play the Lurrus first, I think that would be ideal. That way, you can maybe bait me into swordsing a Lurrus that doesn't actually matter, and then protect your Oswald. Now, I'm not sure that's the correct line, just because we don't currently have the white source, so we're not sure when we're going to be able to cast those Lurrus. We can't give me too many turns because I'm going to start spinning my top and building up a card quality advantage. So it's not straightforward, but it's something to think about is maybe we don't play the Oswald this turn because I already have the answer. We have to try to maybe get the answer out of my hand somehow. So the Oswald comes down and the turn goes back to me. I have a Tundra and I have a Sensei's Top, and then I just immediately am going to Swords this Oswald because I cannot let it untap. I know about the Time Vault in my opponent's hand from the Gataxian Probe, and I mostly just can't let this Oswald activate anyways. Even if there wasn't a Time Vault in my opponent's hand, my opponent turning a Ruby here into a Sensei's Top is going to even out our card quality and spinning advantages here, and it's really going to stop me from doing things. So Oswald gets sent to the fields. My opponent gets to untap and does draw the Flooded Strand. So now has the ability to play Lurrus. The Lurrus, no longer has to worry about that Swords to Plowshares, but the Lurrus isn't actually returning anything. So what's it doing from here? I'm not sure exactly what my opponent achieves by passing here. I would probably just play out the Lurrus because you want to utilize your mana efficiently. Maybe he's bluffing a force or something. Not 100% sure. But I get to spin. I get to go to the next turn here, and then we can see how this game unfolds from there. Trying to see exactly what we have on top here. I can't remember. It looks like a Soul Guide Lantern, maybe a blue card, a Snapcaster Mage. And I think I do spin a Snapcaster Mage at the top, if I remember correctly. Because I know about the Lurrus in my opponent's hand. I'm just going to take the Snap as the most impactful card and then shuffle away the others with Lorien Revealed. I'm just going to build out my mana advantage, use my top to give me card quality as my opponent struggles to find a footing in this game to move forward. These are like the low points of the deck. If you don't have the right cards, you can sometimes draw cards that don't really function with each other. So you can see my opponent here draws an Opal, which while in general is very good, is not actually helping him from this spot. That being said, it is enabling extremely powerful paradoxical outcomes off the top of the library. That's one of the strengths of the deck is you have these really big major hits that you can hit from the top. So my opponent tries to cast this Lurrus without the right mana, but I make sure he goes and gets the right mana. Gets the Lurrus in play, and then passes the turn. I get a nice, extremely valuable Snap Sword, send the Lurrus packing, utilize my full mana, and go to my turn, and now I'm feeling pretty good. I've got a Force in my hand, I've got a Fluster in my hand, I have a Dig in my hand, and basically my plan is to make sure if my opponent does find something that's worth playing, that we can counter it, as I slowly can grind out this game with a Snapcaster Mage. I get to do, utilize Dig Through Time as an instant, which is really, really, actually, maybe this went to my, let's see. Trying to figure out exactly when I did this. I think I utilize an end step Dig Through Time here, and maybe it's just my turn Dig Through Time. I can't remember. Either way, it's meant by a Force, and I just let it get countered. The Dig Through Time, okay, looks like it was on end step here. So that's one of the nice parts about PO and about Dig Through Time is they let you play with your Flusterstorm up, play on your opponent's turn. I get my opponent to fully tap out, but like mostly tap out. And I don't fight over this because I don't need to. I have a Sensei's top. I've got good cards. I can just continue to push forward in this game. It's possible that this Dig Through Time is actually a little early. I could, of course, spin, try to build up my mana a little bit more so that I can Dig Through Time with Flusterstorm. But Flusterstorm is actually not going to be turned on a lot of the time here, especially if my opponent keeps building out their mana situation. So I think it's fine to force the issue here and see if there's anything left in my opponent's hand. From here, I have a Snapcaster Mage. I try to figure out what else happens here. Snapcaster Mage attacks maybe a couple times. Oh, I Time Walk into another Snapcaster Mage attack. Just trying to tempo my opponent out. And then I have a nice little portable hole here. This portable here takes the Ruby because it turns off the Opal. And because it doesn't have Metalcraft anymore. So a little bit of a 2-for-1. And I'm just basically playing a little bit slow, building it out, and my opponent's hand has not a whole lot happening. There's still the Time Vault in the hand, and not much is going on. So the Portable Hole comes back down. Portable Hole is going to probably take out my Snapcaster Mage, because my Snapcaster Mage is what's clocking Andrew, 5 more hits, and that wins. So the Portable Hole comes in, I do a little spinning, and basically I'm just trying to use my Sensei's Top to end the game here. We're looking for combo-oriented ways to get this game over with. And there it is. It's PO for 4 total. Everything comes back. And then from there, just using the Sensei's Top to find the PO, and the game is just going to end shortly after. Not shortly after, because there's a lot of game actions that have to take place first. But basically, PO finds a bunch more mana, finds another PO. I can use a Portable Hold, take that to the Snapcaster Mage. The Snapcaster Mage coming back from the Portable Hole lets me flash back. I can flash back the PO with the Snapcaster Mage that was under the Portable Hole. And this all just spirals. And eventually I find Time Vault and Key and attack my opponent for lethal. So that was a really cool game. I love coverage games. You get to see a lot of things. I tried to make sure in this coverage that you're not too hard on Andrew. Playing perfectly under the very bright Anurag lights is hard. And I think it's just a good learning experience. From my side, maybe I am keeping too low on the range. Like, I was definitely presented with a game 1 where my hand was not sufficient to win the game. It did win the game with some like little quick clever plays and just full maximizing the low value cards that I had. But in general, maybe not enough to fully win. The Lurrus PO matchup is kind of volatile. Hands that look like this. If my opponent has a PO early and I don't have a Force of Will, I could easily lose this game. So really, These matchup is volatile and can go either way. It's like, so if my opponent, hits my demonic tutor, I'm not allowed to get a Force of Will, untaps and draws a PO off the top. Maybe it's a whole different game. So interesting, very fun, very cool match. We ended up talking about it a lot afterwards. Let's see if I have any more notes from this one. Game 1, Luris, Bobble, Caracas, Force, weaker hand, tops. No, that's it. And that's round 2, which will actually end up being my only feature match for the day, but definitely one that was worth remembering. Okay, so in round 3, we're moving on, and I have a 2-0 start. I am playing against Jeffrey. Very nice opponent who was hadn't played too much Magic at the start because he had a round 1 opponent no-show. Jeffrey's on the Ring, the Jewel Shops. And this matchup, I think, is fine for our deck, but it's so volatile because of the inherent nature of the Jewel deck. So, game 1 was very simple. My opponent kept a hand. I kept a hand that did not have a Force. My opponent played a turn 1 6-mana Ring, Jewel, and I died. Game 2, my opponent kept an interesting one. My opponent kept Workshop, Quad Moxen, 1 Ring. He was actually asking after the game, does this make sense? And I think you always have to keep that. I think you always have to keep a payoff that you can play on turn 1. Even if it's not the best possible hand from Jewel, it's definitely one that's in your range to keep. So this game was kind of probably the most interesting of the 3. My opponent played the 1 Ring, which I countered. I then used my mana to vamp for a Null Rod, and I played a Null Rod. This game ended up being very interesting, even though I had a Null Rod, because the Classic Academy came out of my opponent's deck. So we basically playing draw go, playing off the top of the library, where I don't have access to my artifacts, which does make things difficult. Even though Null Rod is much more effective against Jewel, it's still very effective against me. So we're playing a bit of a weird game. My opponent does hit the Academy, so basically anything is turned on. You can play the Jewel, you can play the the Ring. I mean, the Ring to blank for a turn, and most importantly, can draw a PO or sink into Super, bounce the Ring, or pick up the whole hand. So I'm sweating because my Null Rod plan is usually very good unless the player plays Academy. So then we hit a point where the opponent top decks a 3-ball, and I'm still on 2 lands. So now I'm not playing any cards. So I'm super dead to a variety of different top decks. So we're going back and forth. We go back and forth. I finally hit a 3rd land, and I play an Oswald. And I'm still in a lot of trouble because with the Academy, all of these draws are still live. I'm waiting to see what happens. And it just so happened that my opponent did not hit anything for the next 3 turns that was significantly impactful. And what I did was Oswald a Mox into a key, Oswald a 1-drop into a Time Vault, and then Oswald my Null Rod away for nothing and take infinite turns. Extremely wild, very crazy game. I did not expect it to be very close, but that's the kind of the nature of the Null Rod to Larian Academy interaction. We move on to game 3. My opponent keeps a very, very strong Jewel hand of turn 1 Ring with Force backup. I Force. He forces back, resolves the Ring. So this game is basically over from the first turn. However, the game goes on a little bit because on the second turn, my opponent has a Time Vault in hand, so tries to tinker into Vault Key combo. He thinks for a minute and then tinkers using the 1 Ring as the sack. You don't really have to do this, but I understand why my opponent did it. They wanted to make sure they couldn't lose when the Vault Key was in play. However, you're very seldom going to lose to a 1 Ring from a very high life total. You will eventually find a way to get rid of the 1 Ring, whether it's a new Metamorph or a new Ring or something else. So you don't have to tinker away the Ring, and an opponent ends up getting punished for this because I had a Spell Pierce in my hand and Spell Pierce the Tinker. So the game actually goes on. From there, my opponent does have a Masticore follow-up, and Masticore is not that threatening for me. There are lots of different ways in which I can deal with a Masticore. Post board, I have swords, I have seals, I have all kinds of things that will deal with Masticore, so I'm not too worried. I end up tutoring Mystical Tutor, Merchant Scroll for a PO, looking to win the game on the next turn and not actually care about this Masticore. Unfortunately, my opponent top decks a Trinisphere, Trinispheres me, and my PO is no longer online. Yeah, could not find an answer to a Masticore, and I take my first loss of the tournament. In round 4, I'm paired up against Oath of Druids. Oath of Druids is a matchup that I think is pretty good, but again, this is Oath combo deck is very powerful, very linear, and you'll start to see many of the Oath players are registering a ton of null rods in their sideboard, thanks to maybe videos by me and Brian saying that you need these null rods in order to beat Jewel. This could come back and make life very challenging for me. We'll see what happens. Game 1, I start, and my opponent starts, and Thoughtseize my Force of Will. Not a great thing for me. I don't have my interaction now. The coast is clear. My opponent resolves Oath with a Forbidden Orchard, and I lose. Game 2, I start, and I have an early Cage, and we play a very weird game where my opponent has an early Oko. So I have a lot of things stopped up to beat the Oath aspect, but my opponent just starts making food and baking 3/3s and attacking. So we actually play a very fair, almost, bug control versus Luris game where I have to worry about any of my things being elked. Very challenging game, very long game, and I'm starting to get attacked. I start to use some of the removal spells I kept in my deck to slow down my opponent, try to stop the number of elks from being made, and push forward. I end up resolving an Oswald with a key in play. So from there, I need to be very careful, see if I can't push through a Vault Key combo. The big wrinkle in this is if my opponent could just elk my Oswald, right? Not the case because I actually have a Karakas in play. So if my opponent elks my Oswald, I just bounce the legendary elk back to my hand and replay it on the following turn. Now this would go on forever, but it would also mean my opponent's not able to make any more elks and continue to pressure me. So my opponent, feeling the pressure to do something else, goes for a little bit of a risky line. My opponent goes for a show and tell and elks the Cage so that we can push forward by using Citadel off of the show and tell and combo off the top. Unfortunately for my opponent, the combo off the top bricks, and I end up getting Vault Key. It was a pretty crazy sequence. My opponent, there was lots of choices, so it's not exactly clear what my opponent was supposed to do in the situation. But my opponent didn't really have any ways forward, so they went with the most volatile line of turning off the Cage that was in play with the Oko and trying to show and tell a Citadel and seeing if that would be enough. There was also an instance in that game where I had a PO, and I wanted to hold it for one turn to see if I could make sure that I didn't get like Flusterstormed or Besieged or anything like that. And I ended up getting it Thoughtseize. So that was like maybe I shouldn't hold this. This is like the only way it gets possibly punished. And that's another reason why my opponent maybe not like elking the Cage or something earlier, is I have lots of ways to return the Cage with PO and that kind of thing. So very, very challenging game, lots of back and forth, but eventually the Oswald put enough pressure on my opponent to make them go for a bit of a risky line, which got punished, and then I Vault Key and win. Game 3 ended up being a little different. There was an early strip mine and some null rods. There was an Oath of Druids in play, but no Orchard. And so I let the Oath resolve. Well, I think I had to let the Oath resolve, but the Oath just stayed in play and I couldn't play creatures, which is not a huge problem. I boarded out a bunch of creatures in the matchup, so I just needed to do my best to build out before my opponent finds an Orchard. So what I do is I have a portable hole, and eventually I put the portable hole on the Oath. And I don't end up ever playing my Containment Priest in my hand because I'm super worried about a decay on, like a Besage on the portable hole, a decay on my Containment Priest or something like that, in a situation where uncounterable things happen and an Oath gets to go off. And it actually eventually hits a point where my opponent does find an Orchard and has a decay. And so I don't know how to reconcile from here. I'm like, oh no, what am I gonna do? Like I don't actually have enough ways to stop this from happening, until I realize I have a Mind Break Trap in my hand. With the Mind Break Trap, I can actually exile the Abrupt Decay on the stack, even though it can't be countered, and save the game. So I play out my Containment Priest, I pass to my opponent's turn, they are very confused. They go for the Abrupt Decay on the Containment Priest with the Oath trigger on the stack, and I exile the Abrupt Decay with Mind Break Trap and go on to win that game. A very wild game. Lots of things had to be like held back because I was too worried about uncounterable ways to stop things from happening, like Decay, Beseiju. There were lots of different ways there that I had to play around, and luckily I was able to find a line that involved Mind Break Trap on the Decay. I think going over the game, I had another line that I could have done where I actually Luris back a Seal of Cleansing so that I can use the Seal of Cleansing on the Oath if it came back from underneath a portal or something. It was a wild game, but a really cool back and forth showing. Get the win, and now I'm 3-1. Round 5, I ended up versus Mono Red, a player who said they hadn't played too much Vintage, but was very excited to play in this tournament and was having a good time. You can see here, it's a very interesting version of Mono Red. It's very much like the Legacy deck. It is using a bunch of power and is playing the One Ring. So the null rods are actually much more reduced in this version, only 2 in the sideboard, which makes it probably fairly favorable for me. That being said, we have a game of Magic to play. Let's see what happens. Game 1, my opponent goes Ancient Tomb, Mox the One Ring. I don't have a counterspell. The One Ring resolves, and I am assuming that my opponent is on Jewel. So I have a turn 1 with a bunch of mana, using a Lotus, and I Time Walk, and then I choose to use my rest of my floating mana to cast Balance. Balance as a Mind Rot effect for 2, because I felt like if I'm up against Jewel, this is probably my best time to use Balance, try to reduce the number of cards in their hand. Maybe it'll help stop them from comboing off. This ends up being a huge mistake when my opponent discards Simian Spirit Guide and City of Traders, indicating that they are not, in fact, on Jewel. They are on Mono Red. And I might need this balance later in the game to destroy creatures. Oh, Justin. I still think it was probably in the blind correct, but it did end up being really rough. I do get Blood Moon on the following turn, but it's not a huge problem as I have both a Plains and a Mox Opal to make blue or white mana. I do end up casting a Pio for 5 cards in that game, but don't find the right answers, and I end up losing because I can't balance away my creatures, my opponent's creatures, including multiple Rabble Masters to go with the Magus. So kind of a weird spot where a choice that I made actually really hurt me. So now I know what's going on. I've seen the One Ring, so I'm expecting less Null Rods, and we go to Game 2. Game 2, I have the very powerful turn 1 Luris off of Lotus, return Lotus. I get an Oswald and a Volt Key very quickly, and just easily win the game. Game 3, I am on the draw against Mono Red. My 7-card keep is a bunch of, or sorry, my 7-card hand is a bunch of lands and a force with no blue card, and I decide to mulligan that hand. My 6-card hand is very powerful. Multiple Moxen, Black Lotus, a force with no blue card, but a very quick Volt Key. So I decide to bottom the force, keep my quick Volt Key hand, knowing that my opponent is on less no rods than the normal version of the deck, and I won't get hurt by Blood Moon because I already have all of my mana inside of my Moxen. Unfortunately, my opponent didn't have Null Rod, but they did have Trinisphere. So Trinisphere on the play against my no land hand, I don't draw any lands, and I lose the game. This is a big reason why I like these mono red decks, especially as the unpowered deck of choice, because you just get these free wins off of cards like Null Rod and Trinisphere and Blood Moon that can really make your deck compete with the powerful powered decks of the format. So I'm not upset about that. It's just sometimes you get Vintage, and that was my 2nd loss of the tournament. But there's still a top 32 promo to play for, so I'm going to continue to the next round. I'm now 3-2 going into round 6, and I'm against Sunny Lee. We actually had some fun jokes about during the start of this tournament. We were talking about different videos I had produced and how I hate Bug, and I'm like, oh, it's fine. Like, it's just sometimes it's Bug, and my opponent does end up being on Bug, which is always funny when things you say come back and hit you in the face. So this is a pretty fun matchup in my opinion. There's a lot of back and forth here. I have played multiple matches now versus Montolio online with this deck, so you can check those out. Really interesting matches, lots of back and forth. These games did not go that way. Game 1, my opponent, or I DT'd for an Ancestral, and my opponent had a Collector Roof. I had a Protected Swords, but he couldn't kill my Oswald. And my Oswald Portable Hold the Oof for Volt Key and 1. Basically, just I had a little bit more resources than my opponent. I basically overpowered the number of cards, and just the interaction of Oswald getting Portable Hold to turn off Null Rod effects, extremely powerful. Game 2 was another DT for Ancestral. I play a very slow game with constructs into a PO and just kind of overpower my opponent that way. This is part of what happens when you play blue decks versus each other in Vintage. Even if, you know, theoretically this bug deck might have a very strong matchup against what you're trying to do, if you resolve your Ancestral Recall and your opponent's not resolving Ancestral Recall, you are so far ahead. Onward to round 7, where we're 4-2 up against Robert here, and we're up against Mono White Initiative. Pretty fun matchup. There's a lot of tension in this matchup, and the games we played were actually quite wild. So game 1, I was on the play, won the die roll, and played a turn 1 Vexing Bobble. Typically, Vexing Bobble in Vintage very good at stopping fast starts and stopping Force of Will, and I very much like it on the play against Mono White, because what it does is it stops them from using all of this fast mana. It's going to really slow down what your opponent's trying to do. So the game gets real slow. I'm playing a bunch of stuff, and I actually immediately draw Black Lotus that I can't play under my Bobble. But I'm like, okay, it's going to be fine. I'm going to end up cracking my Bobble eventually, and I'll use my Black Lotus to do a very powerful combo turn before my opponent gets online. That's not what happened. My opponent hits the mana requirements to play Boromir. Boromir is like a Vexing Bobble, and so now I can't play my Lotus. So the game gets really slow, eventually to the point where my opponent actually resolves a Cavern on Archon, Archon. And so I'm actually in a lot of trouble. I have all these resources, I have all of these cards, but I can't really use them. Thankfully, we did not cut the Dress Down from the deck, so an end of turn Dress Down turns off not only the Boromir, but also the double Archon. So 3 different hate pieces where I can crack my Bobble, untap, and combo out. Game 2 is an odd one. I keep a Mindbreak Trap opener, and my opponent does lead in with Mox, Lotus, 3-drop. It's a Boromir, which I get Mindbreak Trap. He then only follows up with an Urza Saga, which is a great sign. It means there's not any extra creatures left in the hand. The play was definitely going to be Boromir plus Saga. I have Seal of Cleansing in my deck because I'm keeping that in for Stony Silences, mostly Null Rods and Stony Silences. And so I actually have a clean answer to Urza Saga. So I seal the Saga. He gets 1 construct, but then follows up with different initiative creatures, and then a very key Peacekeeper, naming a PO that's not in my hand, but is basically my only way out of the deck. A very solid name from my opponent. I thought my opponent played pretty well in these games from hard spots. So the Peacekeeper slows down my PO. Athalia comes down that I can't kill because they have their own Caracas. And even though I have a PO, I can't really replay a second PO. I do draw a PO, and I can't actually put enough cards together to play through both a Peacekeeper and Athalia, and I eventually die. So we move on to game 3. Game 3, my opponent does do some mulliganing, finds a bit of a subpar hand, unfortunately. That's something that comes with the Mono White Initiative deck. I lead off with a very powerful Soul Ring Mana Vault hand against a very slow 6 from my opponent. I do end up forcing a Stony Silence, where I eventually untap, use my Mana Vault to cast a Lorien, draw 3 cards, and win the game with a lot of power. So kind of a not a great ending to what was actually a very powerful set of 2 games. But a very interesting mono white matchup. I thought this matchup was one of the more interesting ones of the tournament, just because the way the games played out was not normal. They were just very small percentage games. We talked a little bit about the decks. For March of the Other, Early Light is a very good card against my deck, as is Witch Enchanter and Seasoned Engineer. So this, with 4 Stony Silence as well, very challenging matchup. Very happy to get a win against such a challenging matchup. So we're still X2. We're fighting for our final top 32 slot with a 7-2 finish. That's what we're looking to do in this tournament. We get paired up against Ben Lucas, a friend on you may know him as I Draft the Beats, Dredge in this tournament. He was able to borrow a full Dredge deck, and we actually have a really funny and loud showing. The games themselves, not the most interesting because it's Dredge, but we had a good time out of it. Game 1. Ben mulls to 4, and it tells me his hand is a full house or something similar. And and plays out the Bazaar of Baghdad, and I vamp for a strip and wasteland the Bazaar. But it turns out he was not lying with his hand that did have full house, and so actually has a negation for my spell and a second Bazaar. I don't find the right answers, and I just lose. I lose to the second Bazaar, and I die. We talked about a little bit after, was there a better vamp? Like, should I vamp knowing my opponent has two Bazaars? I don't know. It was a little bit of a mess, but there wasn't actually very good vamp targets, so I think it ended up being fine. Because I definitely am not going to be able to beat double Bazaar. A really weird spot. We go to game 2. Ben mulligans to 1, does not find a Bazaar. I play a Priest, and he loses. Go to game 3. He keeps 6. I keep a hand that had like Mana Crypt, Time Walk, Opal. I take a Time Walk. He vigors my Mana Crypt and my Opal, but I don't really care too much because I untap, play another land, and play Containment Priest. And then he just never really finds an answer to Containment Priest, and I win with the rest of the cards in my hand. So fairly uneventful dredge match. Lots of mulliganing, so like just unfortunate from my opponent's side of the table. Pretty crazy that I would lose actually in game 1. That game was wild because I did have ways to win the game. Like I could draw into the Vault Key, I could draw into all these other things, but he ended up hitting 4 Creeping Chills in the top like 30 cards or so, and so I actually got tempoed out really quickly by the Bazaar. Just a wild set, but always fun to be able to play against Ben. Dredge is dredge. And then we head to the final round, the 9th and final round, where I'm up against Reprint Dark Ritual on Oath. Game 1, there was an Oath that resolved, but there was no Orchard. I played a pretty long game because I couldn't actually use Oswald and Key, but I eventually just drew Paradoxical Outcomes and won with Vamp for Vault Key before the Orchard had a chance to turn the game around. Game 2, turn 1 Orchard, which I answered with Portable Hole immediately, and then my opponent really didn't find any answers after it. The deck kind of fizzled out, and I eventually get a Luris and start looping Seal of Cleansings, turning off all the mana and giving my opponent no outs. Not the most eventful deck, but not the most eventful finish, but a pretty apt description of why I don't like the Oath deck. It has just a lot of air, and you don't really have a lot of ways to come back after your turn 1 payoff is countered. In this case by a Portable Hole. So that was actually just an uneventful round 9 end to the tournament, and I do make it 7-2. I am so happy. I'm like, oh, actually, what a great finish after like a little bit of a rocky start. I'm 7-2. That should mean I am top 32. I'm gonna get my Tinker promo. I'll be able to play it in my Tinker decks forever. You know, pretty valuable promo. However, that was not the case, as you see my name here down in 35th place. Turns out I had the worst tiebreakers of all the 7-2s, and there were so many 7-2s that even though 7-2 was a 9th place finish, it went all the way down to 35th place finish. So me, Bosch and Roll, and Spencer here all end up missing on a top 32 promo, even though we ended with a 7-2 record. I don't know if there's much we can do about that. Like, you know, the Wizard is only printing 32 copies here, so it's a little hard to say. I don't know. I feel sad about it. It's a little unlucky, but also, what can you do? Win more Magic. The only the only counter argument to the win more Magic, which is the normal position I take when I break her out of top 8 on Magic Online. Oh, you just win one more round of Magic, you be top 8. Here, if I win one more round of Magic, I would actually top 8 the tournament. So there was really nothing record-wise between 7-2, miss top 32, and 8-1, make top 8. Which is like just kind of weird and frustrating. But overall, I can only be happy with how this tournament went. The rounds I lost, I didn't feel like were things I had agency over, right? I lost a round to Jewel where my opponent had just really strong Jewel hands and I wasn't able to have the right answers. And I lost a mono red where my opponent transferred me and I kept a hand with no lands. The mono red matchup, I do, somewhat regret using that balance. But I definitely wouldn't ever expect my opponent who started Ancient Tomb, Mox, One Ring to be mono red. I would have always expected that to be Jewel. I don't think it's fair to include mono red in the range of hands that would keep that deck, or of decks that would keep that hand in the context of Vintage. Obviously in Legacy that's different, but in Vintage you expect your mono red opponents to be more null rod oriented decks. So I'm not too hung up about those losses. I think those losses were part of the format. And another bread and butter 7-2 finish here. I'm very happy overall and looking forward to 4 seasons and Eternal Weekend Europe. It's likely I place this deck or similar. I can't imagine having a 7-2 finish and being put off of this deck. It really ran exactly how I wanted it to run. I didn't have as many powerful PO starts as I would have hoped, but I had lots of powerful Lotus starts and Volt Key starts. So I think it's simply a run a little hotter, maybe play a little cleaner, and it can turn that 7-2 into a top 8. I like how this deck features into the metagame that we see here. I don't really have any problem with these matchups. Obviously, all of these matchups are losable because this is vintage, but I am overall extremely happy with how the deck played and how I played over a 9-round event for a very nice 7-2 finish. Although vintage was over, there was still an 11-round, over 1,000 player legacy event to play. I haven't played too much legacy going into the event, so I didn't have high expectations, but I found this deck from Dave Kaplan and Andreas Peterson that I liked. It was aggressive, but still plays Force of Will, Daze, Wasteland, Brainstorm. So it's playing all the most powerful cards, but still takes an aggressive slant, which I actually kind of like against the various combo-oriented decks in the field. From what I could tell, I liked how this deck lined up against what was going to happen in the field. That being said, I didn't have any practice with this deck, so a bunch of learning would have to happen on the fly. And I do have all my notes from between the rounds, and my opponents were, again, very helpful in talking through these games and lines with me post-match, things I can improve, things that we could have done differently, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to quickly run through my 11 rounds of Legacy. If you haven't seen this deck before, this is actual factual Delver of Secrets, not Delver in quotation marks. I am playing Delver of Secrets, Nethergoyfs, Psychic Frogs, and Murktide Regents backed by Dazes and Fatal Pushes as a way of tempoing out my opponents in this format that is so heavily either Blue-Black Reanimator or combo-oriented decks. It is something worth noting here that I have realized after the tournament that I did, in fact, cheat. I registered the wrong deck list for this event. I never caught it throughout the event. Didn't end up getting deck check or do very well in the event, so kind of lucky in that sense. But basically, this is the 75 that I played in the event. I accidentally registered -1 Reanimate, +1 Thoughtseize. Not exactly sure how that happened. But I think maybe when I made this Moxfield link before, I didn't include the Reanimate from the list I copy-paste from. And just another reminder to always double-check your work and make sure you end up with the exact list you played. I definitely wanted to make sure I pointed that out because I had some really interesting plays with Reanimate throughout the entire tournament, and I was going to talk about it a lot during the whole thing, so it's very important for me to say that, yes, I did in fact play Reanimate, even though I accidentally did not have it in my registered list. That being said, I did not have a very high finish in this tournament, so hopefully no harm, no foul, and we can talk about how these matches played out. Okay, round 1 of our 11-round Legacy event. I'm up against Matthew here, who is playing the first of many different kind of Nadu decks that I played against. This one is Nadu Breakfast, where you're doing the Cephalid Illusionist Nomads combo and returning the Thassa's Oracle with Dread Return. Game 1, I had double Delver, a great start to the tournament, but I maybe made a mistake or a greedy line where I played a Brainstorm at end of turn into a Daze. And I did this on purpose because I had a Fatal Push in my hand that I only had 2 lands for, and I wanted to make sure I could make all of my plays and remove their combo piece before. So basically, I was running the Daze into a possible, running Brainstorm into a possible Daze, so that I wouldn't have to worry about getting my removal spell for their combo Dazed. This ended up, happening. My Brainstorm did get Dazed, which I don't think is a huge deal, because as long as I top deck an instant or sorcery in the couple turns following that, it will end up working out for me. Unfortunately, I top decked 5 lands in a row, neither Delver flipped, and I died. That being said, I'm still not sure exactly where I land on if I should or should not have, but it was definitely because my Brainstorm got countered that I was unable to flip. Actually, I guess maybe that's not the case, because if I'm hitting 3 lands, as long as if one of them is a fetch land, then I can at least fetch away. But Anyways, it was an unfortunate set of draws where my Delvers ended up missing 4 times, and I lost, which is not a good start for the Delver of Secrets. Game 2, there was an early Frog. There was double Thoughtseize, and there was a bunch of removal. I have a push. I have a Shoot the Sheriff in my hand. I have this Frog drawing me cards. I'm feeling pretty good. I chose to play a Delver. I have 3 mana. So I chose to play a Delver to try to increase my clock while instead of holding up double removal spell for the opponent's combo. I had recently double seized my opponent's hand, so I knew that they didn't have all of the pieces they needed. They had 1 piece in their hand, and they had the Brainstorm. Unfortunately, Brainstorm is a very powerful Magic card. So my opponent brainstormed with the 1 combo piece, found the 2nd combo piece, and had Force of Will blue card Daze. So even though I had removal for the combo, I did end up just dying from that spot. Looking back and talking with my opponent, I think I made the right choice. I do need to get the thing going. It's not a very high likelihood that my opponent had, would be able to hit that kind of interaction from that spot. We also went over, what did I want to Thoughtseize? Because I had chosen to Thoughtseize a Nomad instead of choosing to Thoughtseize an Illusionist. And he said that made a lot of sense because, there's only 6 ways the Illusionist would go off here. What are 6 ways the Illusionist goes off? Instead of 8 ways when you have the Nomads with the Nadu. So it made sense for me to take the Nomads and cut off the number of ways that go off. But unfortunately, my opponent did find the Shuko as well as the Force Post Daze. So an early round 1 loss in a matchup that I think is probably pretty good. We have a million removal spells. We have main deck Nihil Spellbomb, and my opponent is very much all in on this Dread Return combo. So actually having like a kind of main deck hate would have been pretty nice, though I guess my opponent does actually have this Memories Journey here, which is a pretty cool little tech, where if I were to exile everything with the Dread Return on the stack, they could at least Memories Journey back the Thoughtless Oracle and cast it on the following turn, which I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, nonetheless, a round 1 loss to Nadu Breakfast. We move into round 2, and I'm against Jeremiah on a Yorion deck. I know that the Death and Taxes decks in Legacy are Yorion based. I know that most Yorion reveals are going to be Death and Taxes, but some might still be various control decks. And we played a really cool round 2. I had a Nethergoyf on turn 1 versus an Aether Vial, and I was actually able to bait my opponent to an early Solitude on the Nethergoyf, which cleared the way for a Murktide Regent, where Vial didn't really get to do anything, and the Murktide Regent was able to win the game. Game 2 was a little bit different. I Thoughtseize away a Stoneforge Mystic, Stoneforge, leaving my opponent with a Spirit Guide, not Spirit Guide, a Spirit of the Labyrinth. I thought I was in a very strong spot. I had this Murktide Regent. It would be really strong. It'd be a really good spot. However, my opponent did find a 2nd Stoneforge Mystic off the top, which is really, really powerful because that Stoneforge Mystic finds a pre-war Formaware. That pre-war Formaware can buy back the other Stoneforge Mystic, and eventually, with all that advantage, gets a Phantom Blade, which destroys my Murktide Regent. After my Murktide Regent is destroyed, I don't have a lot of comeback potential. My opponent eventually buys a Yorion and flickers their entire board, and I have no shot of coming back. Game 3, I play a Delver of Secrets. It gets sorted. I play a Nethergoyf. It gets sorted. I play a Frog. It gets sorted. I force the swords, and then it gets solituded. So all my things get get removed, except I have another Goyf, and I attack for a million turns for 2 every turn with my Goyf. We both flood out. My opponent eventually buys a Yorion, which I shoot the Sheriff on, and I actually do have saved up double interaction for a Emperor of the Bones, which would have returned a Solitude. So my opponent was a very reactive hand, had to use a lot of removal on my vast amount of threats, and I just end up overpowering that by having blue cards Brainstorm and being able to find exactly what I need to push through in the blue versus Death and Taxes matchup. So I'm 1-1, and now I'm up against Eldrazi. Eldrazi is a deck I haven't played against too much, but I know it's been making a lot of rounds in Legacy. Game 1, my opponent plays a Chalice on 1. On the next turn, I play a Frog. And then my opponent does end up playing a Chalice on 2. So I actually can't play anything in my deck. Chalice on 1, I have a very hard time beating. I have almost all 1-drops in my deck, but I do have a Brazen Borrower and I do have frogs. So what I do is I throw 7, 8 cards into this frog and say, I hope this frog gets there. I hope they have no way to answer a frog. However, they do have ways to answer a frog. They have Cavern and Wastscape Battle Mage, uncounterable kick and bounce my frog back to my hand, locking me out of the game and killing me. Thought on Seer's follow-up, whatever. I end up dying. Game 2, I play another Goyf and a Wasteland and another Goyf, and I consign Replicate on a Wastegate Battle Mage plus kick. And so I end up just overpowering with Goyfs and Wastelands. And game 3, I play a Frog, and then I have double Wasteland, and I lock my opponent out of casting spells. So like both games 2 and 3 were just, I registered the card Wasteland, my opponent didn't have enough mana, and I end up winning those games. So now I am 2-1, and I'm on to round 4, and we're up against the second kind of Nadu deck of the tournament. This one is a Bant Nadu deck, Green Sun Zenith, Sylvan Safekeeper, and some sweet Scythe Cat cubs. They're like bristly bills, but they kind of grow faster. Game 1, my opponent has Halfling into Teferi on the play, and I am just completely tempoed out. I have a plow, or he has a plow for my creature, and I get missed. I miss on land drops. I like Brainstorm and miss on lands, and this Teferi is just too much, and eventually the Nadu comes down, and I'm too far behind to come back. Game 2, I have a Goyf, and I actually get to use Orcish Bowmasters to kill the Dryad Arbor and just get super far ahead and tempo my opponent out to a win. Game 3, my opponent ends up mulling to 5, plays a turn 1 elf, which I push, and then I use 2 dazes and a force to stop Teferi and Murktide for the win. My opponent commented on how he was surprised I had all these dazes in post-board, but it was just kind of a hard to board out the cards that I really wanted to. There's a lot of cards that I didn't really want in my deck, like Nihil Spellbomb. And so I ended up keeping some amount of dazes in, and it just so happened that they ran really well against my opponent's mull to 5, like 1 land, multiple halfling draw. So I think like maybe, slight, suboptimal on my part, but it ran, get a little lucky and you end up with the win. So now we're still X-1. We're carrying on. And now I'm up against Chris, which is the third type of Nadu deck we played against in the tournament. And this one I know people call like elves, but there's not many elves left. A natural order Crater Hoof Nadu version. And this felt really hard to beat. This felt like a tough matchup. There's just so many things happening. It's hard to remove everything. I don't have any kind of massive board wipes. So if they overrun my my removal, it's going to be quite hard. So in game 1, I have 3 Nether Goyfs on a mold versus a mold of 5, and I thought I'm in a pretty good spot. Opponent plays the Nantuku on a Noble Hierarch, but this just makes a lot of blockers. It makes the Nether Goyfs really hard to connect. And I just didn't really evaluate how good my Goyfs were going to be in that game, and I didn't try hard enough to take different avenues to win. My opponent eventually finds a Allosaurus Shepherd, turning off my counter magic, and a Safekeeper, turning off my removal. And I'm in a really bad spot where I'm locked on lands, and I can't use removal. I make some incorrect choices revolving around frogs and jumping frogs over pre-combat. I don't utilize my frog. I need to put more resources into my frog and ignore my Nether Goyfs because my Nether Goyfs were never really getting in. I also had a mistake where I didn't play I should have played the frog pre-combat to threaten bigger Nether Goyfs, so my opponent was forced to block the Nether Goyfs with a smaller amount of insect tokens than they previously had. Because I didn't do that, I might have missed out on a couple points of damage, and eventually my opponent found a natural order and hoof to win. Game 2, I flipped 2 Delvers, which is very good. One was a natural flip, one was a brainstorm flip, and then I have double Force of Will for the ambush endurance, and then the untapped Nadu. So it was actually kind of a close game. There was a little bit of a misevaluation on my brainstorm as well. If I had put the brainstorm and put the Brazen Borrower on the bottom, that way I could have pitched the frog instead. So some small, learnings and things that can be improved on for the future. But I was able to make a very nice tempo line, flip some Delvers, counter 2 important spells, and win, which is basically my whole goal of the whole tournament, just to do things like that over and over. Game 3 happens. There's a Hierarch. and there's a Thoughtseize. And from that point on, I just didn't really have enough cards or enough power to stop my opponent. He had multiple Nomads in the hand, had a Chord, had a Natural Order. Oh, sorry, I'm the one who had the Thoughtseize. So I Thoughtseize my opponent. My opponent has like 2 Nomads and a Chord and a Natural Order. Natural Order is the card I can't stop immediately. That immediately wins the game. So I just hit the Natural Order, and I'm trying to like remove these Nomads and try to beat this Chord, but it's just too much. Trying to Bowmaster, but you can't really Bowmaster against Nomads. So nothing really lined up very well, and I kind of got overwhelmed and died. This matchup seemed very, very difficult. Like I said, there's no like big, -2/-2 green creatures or anything like that can really flip it. So I really do need to have a strong hand and get ahead early. Maybe that means I need to mulligan my game 3 hand to something more powerful, but I had a turn 1 Thoughtseize, so I thought it made a lot of sense. But yeah, it seems like a challenging matchup, and I take my second loss of the tournament. So now that is round 5, and I'm 3-2 going into round 6 versus Tsubasa here, who had a very, very cool deck. Super, super cool deck. Almost everything was like altered and signed, and a really nice looking Sneak and Show deck. And this is probably my best played round of the entire tournament, of the entire weekend. I don't really know what got into me in this round, but everything lined up basically perfectly. In game 1, I have like a Delver, and I'm tempoing out and flipping, and I know my opponent is on Sneak and Show based on the cards they played. And what I did is I perfectly played out 8 permanents, including a Nihil Spellbomb, because I couldn't actually counter the Sneak and Show stuff because there was a Vexing Bauble. So definitely a highlight of the tournament for me was how good Vexing Bauble looked in Legacy. Vexing Bauble was very powerful against these force-based blue decks. But I knew the worst thing that could happen is he puts 2 sneaks into play and I die. But if it's only sneak for Emrakul, then I actually have a very high chance of winning, and actually deterministically can win if the only thing that happens is sneak, Emrakul, attack, wipe 6 of my permanents out, because I very purposely fetched and kept myself at 16 life. So I would go down to 1. I would sack everything except for a Delver and a Frog. I would pitch my cards to Frog, and I would attack for lethal on the following turn, and that's exactly what happened. Game 2, I have an early Delver. I have a Goyf. The first Delver gets Pyroblasted. That's fine. I end up holding up a Brazen Borrower so that when my opponent goes for the 1 ring, I actually bounce the Bauble back to hand, negate the 1 ring, and then untap and force the Bauble. I untap from there, and I find Hydroblast. Hydroblast is perfectly timed for the Sneak and Show and my Delver's attack for the win. Everything was basically just on the turn it needed to be, for the exact amount of damage it needed to be. And I thought the game 1 where I played enough permanents to beat an Emrakul attack and stay at 1 life, I just felt like that was the most aware I had been the entire tournament. So I was very happy with this round. And my opponent was super nice, and like I said, had a really cool deck, so that was also pretty sweet. If you know anything about my paper decks do not look pretty. They are the cards that I have that I can play with, that they all do the same actions as the fancy cards, but they just don't look as good. So then we go to round 8. I'm still, X and 2. Round 7, sorry. Still X and 2, and we're up against Ryan here, who was on the Esper Tempo deck. This is one of the decks I thought about playing for the tournament. I chose to play the Blue-Black Delver deck over the Blue-Black Tempo deck or the Esper Tempo deck because I like the idea of attacking with Murktide Regents and not having to worry about all of the choices inherent in playing Tamiyo. I think Tamiyo is a very, very powerful card, but I think it makes too many choices, and I'm liable to make the wrong choices because I don't have enough reps in the tournament. So I was very happy to eliminate some of those choices, and so instead of drawing cards, do damage to my opponent. So we play a 3-game set with versus Esper Tempo. Game 1, I mold a 5. I have a Delver, a Goyf, and a Frog, and I'm holding down the fort with Murktide Regent. My opponent flips a Tamiyo twice, and I can't really Spellbomb my opponent to stop the Tamiyo because they have a Murktide Regent. Yeah, sorry, I flipped that around. I keep doing that. I should probably write in my notes who has which cards, especially when you have 2 playing the same. I have a Delver, a Goyf, and a Frog. My opponent has a Murktide Regent holding down the fort. I can't attack through this Murktide Regent, but he can't attack me because I would hit an attack for lethal. So we have a bit of a stall, and during the stall, he's got a Tamiyo, so it's a little tough. I have a Spellbomb, but I can't use the Spellbomb to stop the Tamiyo because if I Spellbomb, the Murktide Regent grows and lethally attacks me. So it's a really weird spot. I do end up wasting my opponent off of Tundra, and they never really find another white mana to start interacting with the board. And while my opponent can't interact with the board, eventually I get too many attackers, and I can attack and live at 1 life. And that was a crazy, crazy lucky Moldify game 1 win. Game 2, my opponent has an early Murktide Regent and 3 Force of Wills. There was multiple Swords to Plowshares, and I was just unable to get an early footing. In game 3, they Moldify again. I have a Frog, which gets Swords. I have a Goyf, which gets Pendinged. I give another Goyf and a Bowmaster, and my opponent is stuck with Daze, Force in hand, and I'm able to tempo out a win. So still X and 2 on game 1, and we run into the very powerful Juju Bean. Juju Bean is playing one of the breakout decks of this tournament, which is the Fleshraker One Ring Mystic Forge combo deck. And game 1 starts with a Bauble. I Thoughtseize my opponent, and I chose a Ring over a Forge. I thought that would be a lot stronger of a card, a lot more consistent of a card. However, my opponent, being the powerful wizard that he is, plays the Forge and immediately flips over a Glaring Fleshraker and uses this Fleshraker to combo out and kill me. Though, this actually is still my fault. And the reason why is, on turn 1, I have a Swamp and a Fetch Land, and I choose to use the Fetch Land to find an Underground Sea, 1, to represent Daze, and 2, to give me better options on the second turn. However, what I didn't know is I didn't expect my opponent to have a Glaring Fleshraker as the combo piece, and I am unable to Fatal Push the Glaring Fleshraker on the 3rd turn of the game because I don't have Revolt. So if I had instead led on Swamp Thoughtseize, taking away the Daze part, I actually would have had a better chance because I would have been able to maybe kill this Fleshraker, and I don't think I'm going to win from there, but I certainly have a chance to play the game from there. So a big mistake, I die game 1. Game 2, I have a Frog into a Null Rod, and kind of a stalled board state where I end up with some Nethergoyfs, but they can't really attack through Fleshrakers. I didn't know if my opponent had a Needle in their deck or not when an Urza Saga went off, and so like I didn't end up making all the right choices in regards to like pitching to Frog in time. I had Wasteland on Urza's Workshop, and my opponent had Double Saga and like kind of no mana. So they were actually like really confined on mana. But I just didn't know if there was a Needle in the deck. So I didn't make the optimal lines for Psychic Frog because I actually had a Consign, where I would have been able to maybe consign the search from the Urza Saga, give me enough time with these frogs, jump some frogs. But it all just didn't line up the right way, and I think I made some like suboptimal decisions. So even though I stalled into a the game kind of stalled out, and I found a Delver and a Murktide, I attacked all the way to 1, and my opponent goes for the combo out, and misses, and I live at 1 life and win. I was talking to Juju after the match, and he had tried to like shortcut the damages, and I was kind of just in the zone and didn't really hear or didn't really something, and so he missed a 1 damage, and I didn't like acknowledge that he missed 1 damage, so he assumed that I was not going to give him the 1 damage and just went through it, and actually the combo stalled on 1 life and I died. So really in that game he actually won this game because of the mistaken frog things. So kind of actually 2 losses in a row here. I would definitely have given the damage if I had known he missed the damage, but it is what it is. So in game 3 is actually the cleanest of the games that I played. We were playing a bit of a draw go kind of game. We both didn't have like the strongest starts. I have a Consign for an early Bauble, and then a double Daze on a Ring. I have a Force of Will for Karn. I have a Delver, which I blind flip immediately. And so I'm actually tempoing out with a Delver in this game. I have a nice set of counter magic. I'm tempoing out with a Delver. He's kind of flooding out, not hitting the right cards. But eventually he plays a Karn, which I assume I have to force. I pitch my Borrower and I force it, and he then slams a 1 ring. And the 1 ring was just enough to get the combo going and live through the Delver. Combos off and kills me. So really a triple loss here to the Juju. Super powerful. I feel like my deck had the right tools to win this matchup, but I don't think I played very well. I think I played poorly in games 1 and 2. and didn't really give myself the best opportunity to win this set. This is a very strong deck, and you do need to be ready for it, but I do feel like I was ready for it with 4 Consigned to Memories and a Null Rod. Maybe there should be a second Null Rod in the sideboard. That's definitely possible. But yeah, this is a deck, if you're going to tournaments in the future, you need to be ready for this and have the correct sideboard cards for it. So I take up a second loss of the tournament, and I go to the 9th and final round of day 1. I am playing against Ezra on Mono Red Prison. Game 1 was opening turn 1 Fable. I follow up with a Delver. They follow up with Lelia, and then I'm way too far behind, and I just get rolled over by Lelia and Fable. Game 2, I have a Thoughtseize, and then there is a Pyrogoyf or a Nethergoyf. Can't remember. I wrote Goyf down, but I'm not sure if it was a Pyrogoyf or another. I think I had a Nethergoyf and some counters, and then I actually was able to I forced a Broadside Bombardier, or I thought seized a Broadside Bombardier, and then I was able to reanimate my opponent's Broadside Bombardier and attack it and win. In game 3, opponent has a Vexing Bauble, but I actually kept the hand that it was really interesting because I was talking with my opponent. I was like, oh man, this hand, it lines up versus a certain amount of your hands. This one doesn't want. It's like it was a hand that was not going to be very good against like the very fast Blood Moons kind of starts, but it was going to be very good against like a Bauble slower start. And so I was very lucky. My opponent had kept a Bauble hand. I cast Thoughtseize, taking their only relevant card in Fable. I get to remove all the creatures. I reanimate another Broadside Bombardier, and I power through an unlicensed Hearst to get a win. It was actually a really interesting because I'm threatening to return a Nethergoyf, so they use the unlicensed Hearst to take 2 cards out of my yard, but that lets me reanimate a card from their yard, and then eventually I actually bounce something with a Borrower, replay the Borrower, and fling the Borrower with the Broadside Bombardier for lethal. So a pretty fun way to end the final match of the day at 6-3. Sorry, I actually must have miscounted along the way here. I was actually ended the day 6-3 with a loss to Juju, and a loss to Cephalid Breakfast, and a loss to Nadu Cradle. So I am now 6-3 going into day 2. I don't have to play out day 2, but I decided that it'd be good practice going for the next weekend. I'll try to play some more matches here, get some good practice in. And we got some really great practice in because I got to play against Achilles in round 10 on Blue-Black Reanimator, which I hadn't actually got to play against throughout the rest of the tournament. We had some really, really interesting games, which I thought were probably some of the most interesting games of the whole weekend. Game 1, there was a Frog and a Spell Bomb, and I kind of got punished for an early fetch. I kept a hand where I really wanted to have blue and black mana, so I had fetched an Underground Sea and played my Spell Bomb, where my opponent has untaps and plays has a Frog. Unfortunately, I got my Underground Sea Wasteland and I didn't have the follow-up lands. So actually, it was really tough. I was in a bad spot. The Frog is starting to hit, but eventually I do hit my lands, and I actually stabilize with a big Murktide Regent. I had to jam my Murktide Regent directly into a Daze. I had no choice, but there was no Daze on the other side of the table. So the Murktide Regent resolves, immediately stabilizes the game against the Frog, and the game gets to go drawn out for a little while. At some point, at the very near the end of the game, I actually reanimate my opponent's Atraxa, and he misses the Frog, fetch and eat the 3 cards with Frog. So although I reanimate Atraxa, he stifles my Atraxa's trigger, but still Atraxa is a 7/7 flying lifelink vigilance death touch thing, combined with Murktide Regent is a 1-turn swing for a lethal. So I think I maybe made maybe an incorrect choice on my fetch land in the beginning of the game, but still my opponent drew really poorly, and I was able to get my way out of it. In that game, both of us cast 0 brainstorms, which was kind of the pivotal point of the game. We played a very modern-like game of Magic the Gathering, where none of us were able to fix our hands with brainstorm. And if you had able to cast brainstorm in that game, it probably would not have been remotely close. Game 2 was a pretty crazy back and forth game. Lots of creatures, and once again, a big Murktide stabilizing the board. I end up getting pressured down by a Barrowgoyf. Barrowgoyf is really, really annoying, especially if I don't have like a Revolt ready to Fatal Push it. I have to use a Shoot the Sheriff. I had to end up blocking this with 2 Nethergoyfs. It's very unfortunate because if your opponent has anything that you don't have in the yard, Then this Baraglyph is always bigger than the Nethergoyf as well. So you kind of always are double blocking it though. And then I made a mistake in blocks where I had a frog, and my opponent was attacking for 5, and I'm at 5, and he has a brazen borrower and a 2/2 army. And so I can do a lot of different things. I can discard a card from my hand, make the frog bigger, and then discard by exactly 3, or exile exactly the 3 cards in my library or my graveyard to jump and kill the borrower. But that would cost me my whole graveyard and my card in hand. Or I can keep the cards in my graveyard. I can block the orc army and then discard to make the frog a 2/3, killing off the orc army and keeping my thing in play. Unfortunately, I made the second choice there, where I blocked the orc army and went for the +1/+1, and my opponent stifled my activated ability, meaning I lost the card, and my thing did not grow, so it died to the army, and I took 3 in the air. All around, just really, really rough sequence. If I had instead, before blocks, pitched and then tried to leap, it would have just ended up in a much, much better spot. So a big combat mistake there against not playing around Stifle actually ends up making me lose that game. And then game 3, we had to play very, very fast to try to finish on time. I kept a low action hand, and I couldn't really fight over the frog because of a possibility of getting reanimated on. And then he just had all the answered all my stuff, and I died in like a 3-4 minute fest. But the game 2 was really, really awesome, back and forth, cool blocks, and then I actually lost on just incorrect evaluation of combat and blocking. So lots to learn from that game. And then round 11, the final round of the tournament, I play against Tempo Doomsday, which is the first time I've ever played against this deck. I was very confused. I started my game with Ponder and the ordering in a way that would make sense if my opponent was on like a frog. I would actually have a Shoot the Sheriff the turn that the frog would come down. However, my opponent played turn 1 Lotus Petal Frog, completely making my order awful. And then following up, I have to force a will it because my Shoot the Sheriff is way too far down. That gets dazed. So they get 1 card off the frog before I do end up shooting the frog. But I basically run out of things at that point, and my opponent resolves a Doomsday and wins. Game 2, I kept maybe a bad hand. I think I maybe need to keep more creature-oriented hand, but I kept a hand that had like Thought Seizes and Forces and stuff like that. And I took my opponent's Tameo out of their hand and left them with a pretty weak hand. But they were able to brainstorm and find a new Tameo, and then had so much removal for every creature I drew that the Tameo ultimately ultimated. And drawing through the whole deck, it was pretty funny because when he was about to ultimate the Tameo, we talked about the fact that I can have Orcish Bowmaster here and you might die. And my opponent did not wait to ultimate the Tameo. And I actually had Orcish Bowmaster as the top card of my library. So I did not have that, and I did lose. So I ended up finishing this tournament 6-5. Overall, I was very happy with my deck. I felt that most of the matches I lost, I made serious play mistakes that caused me to lose. Some of them were based on the fact that I didn't have enough testing. I didn't know the decks very well enough. And then some of them were just magic mistakes. So I actually really like the idea of this Dimir, Tempo, Delver deck into the field that we saw. I do think that if you have enough stuff in your sideboard, you can make a really good matchup against that Carnforge deck. I felt like you had decent showings against the blue-black Reanimator deck. You have a lot of different tools. There's a bit of a mind game of like how much removal do you need to keep in, how much like anti-graveyard stuff you're supposed to bring in. That's very hard to determine and probably changes from game to game. I don't really like the spell bombs, but I didn't play against Reanimator as much as some other players did. Dan had registered this deck, and he played against a bunch of Reanimators, so the spell bombs were a lot better. I was thinking like maybe Mishra's Baubles would be like more useful at doing our game plan and making the graveyard faster and making delves faster. But if you need this extra anti-graveyard hate, then it makes sense to have these spell bombs. So I did feel like this deck list was good. I actually thought the Delver of Secrets was pretty good. The Nethergoyf was good for when it was very good when it was good, and it was very bad when it was bad. When an opponent had like lots of ways to block on the ground, it was very annoying. But when an opponent didn't have things, just having this like recurring answer, recurring threat was very, very strong. So overall, like Murktide was actually just great all day. So Murktide was definitely the best part of the creature base. Frog, I actually didn't win like that many games by like doing the frog thing, maybe one or two. But everyone is like very ready to answer frog. You do a lot of battling over frog, so it makes sense that frog gets answered and you win most of your games with these other attacking creatures. The only change I had made to the original deck list was putting the Brazen Borrower in over the third Nihil Spellbomb, and that was so good. This Brazen Borrower was incredible all day, bouncing things and blocking and attacking for lethal. I would always like to play the first Borrower, especially because you want to have an answer for Chalice of the Void on one. And then the tech from Kaplan with the reanimate was also pretty good. You heard multiple times where I reanimated Atraxa. I reanimated multiple broadside bombardiers. There are definitely times where the reanimate wasn't as strong, but when it's not strong, you can just like brainstorm it away or pitch it a frog. So I think having this kind of versatility is very nice inside of your brainstorm deck. So that's the end of my wrap up here for Eternal Weekend North America, both legacy and vintage. Lots to talk about. I hope I was able to provide some interesting and fun things to talk about for all my rounds this time. Definitely getting used to the idea of maybe doing post-match analysis and making notes. I need to do a little bit better on my note taking so I can determine which side had which cards. But well, you know, these are things we can learn going into the next couple events. Because I do like making these wrap up videos and people seem to like them as well. I want to make them as useful as possible. Going into the next 2 weekends, I'm going away. I'm going to Italy to play Four Seasons, and then I'm going to Prague to play Eternal Weekend. So I'm going to be away. I do have 3 different videos still recorded that will go up while I'm away. These were all recorded pre-Eternal Weekend, and they were pre-Eternal Weekend testing videos. So obviously, the timeline doesn't exactly line up here, but hopefully you can enjoy them anyways. And I'm going to see if I can either record one more video or maybe do a commentary on the top 8 of Vintage to try to get as many videos as I can so that you still have things to watch while I am out playing cards and seeing Europe. More Vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.